On a cold February morning in 1943, a telegram arrived in Tokyo that would forever change Japan's war, and what it said was something the Nazi regime desperately wanted to keep hidden from the world. Ambassador Oshima Hiroshi, stationed deep in wartime Berlin, had witnessed the unthinkable. Germany's Sixth Army, over 290,000 men, the pride of the Wehrmacht, had simply ceased to exist at Stalingrad. 91,000 survivors, starving, skeletal, frozen to the bone, had surrendered to Soviet forces just one day earlier. It was Germany's first catastrophic defeat of the entire war, and Oshima's message made brutally clear what Berlin's propaganda machine could never admit. The Wehrmacht, the unstoppable German war machine, was no longer invincible. Foreign Minister Togo Shigenori read that telegram 3 times, each word sinking deeper into his mind, before he walked it personally to Prime Minister Tojo Hideki's office. When he arrived, neither man could speak for several long minutes. The silence in that room was deafening because both men understood something terrifying. Japan's entire strategic position, everything they had gambled on, rested on a foundation that had just cracked wide open. The Tripartite Pact, signed back in September 1940, had bound Japan, Germany, and Italy together in an alliance built on one massive assumption: Axis dominance. Germany was supposed to crush the Soviet Union and grind Britain into the dust. Japan would secure Asia and the Pacific. Together, they would force America to accept a new world order, their world order. But now, if Germany couldn't defeat the Soviets, if the mighty Wehrmacht could be surrounded, trapped, and annihilated in the frozen ruins of Stalingrad, then what did that mean for Japan's war? What did it mean for everything they had sacrificed? Tojo's response came fast, and it was loud. At a press conference just 2 days later, he expressed Japan's deepest sympathy for Germany's setback, but he insisted with absolute conviction that this loss changed nothing. The Greater East Asia War and the European War are one struggle, he declared to the assembled reporters. Temporary reverses cannot alter the ultimate outcome. Germany's fighting spirit remains unbroken, and Japan's commitment to the Axis cause is absolute. The newspapers across the empire dutifully printed every word. Radio stations broadcast his message from Tokyo to Manchuria to the occupied territories. But behind closed doors, in the private meetings of the Supreme War Council, a very different conversation was beginning to take shape. Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, the brilliant commander of Japan's combined fleet, had never believed Germany would win quickly. He had studied at Harvard, served as a naval attaché in Washington, and he understood American industrial capacity in ways that most Japanese leaders simply did not. When the news from Stalingrad arrived, Yamamoto was deep in planning operations in the Solomon Islands, desperately trying to hold a defensive perimeter that was already starting to crumble around him. He told his closest staff members something chilling. Germany's defeat, he said, meant the Soviets would eventually turn their full, overwhelming strength eastward toward Japan. We are now in a race, he explained quietly. Can we secure our position before the Americans overwhelm us and before the Soviets are free to act in Asia? He gave Japan 2 years at most. In just 4 months, Yamamoto would be dead, his plane shot down over Bougainville by American fighters who had decrypted his exact travel schedule. The army leadership, however, saw Stalingrad through a completely different lens. General Sugiyama Hajime, chief of the Army General Staff, argued forcefully that Germany's setback was merely tactical, not strategic. The Wehrmacht still held vast territories deep inside the Soviet Union. German industry still outproduced Soviet factories, he claimed confidently, though his intelligence reports were years out of date and dangerously wrong. The Army's position was brutally simple. Japan had committed itself to total war against America, Britain, and the Netherlands. Retreat was impossible. National honor demanded they fight onward to either complete victory or total annihilation. If Germany was weakening, then Japan must fight even harder to compensate for their ally struggles. The idea that the Axis might actually lose, that this grand alliance might fail, was not yet something anyone dared speak aloud in Army headquarters. But in the Navy Ministry, doubts were quietly growing like cracks in ice. Admiral Yonai Mitsumasa, who would later become Navy Minister, began keeping an intensely private diary in the spring of 1943. His entries, discovered only after the war ended, reveal a man watching his nation march steadily toward catastrophe and feeling utterly powerless to stop it. "The German reversal troubles me greatly," he wrote in March. "If they cannot defeat Russia after 2 full years of trying with all their superior equipment and training, what hope do we possibly have against America's infinite resources? Yet I cannot speak these thoughts aloud to anyone. To question victory now is to invite immediate accusation of defeatism or far worse." The intelligence reports from Berlin kept flowing into Tokyo week after week. Ambassador Oshima, a fervent true believer in ultimate German victory, tried desperately to present each new development in the most positive light imaginable. When Rommel's Afrika Korps surrendered in Tunisia in May, Oshima reported that this actually freed up German forces for redeployment to the critical Eastern Front. When the Allies invaded Sicily in July, he emphasized Germany's elaborate defensive preparations and fighting spirit. But the underlying trend was becoming undeniable to anyone reading carefully between the lines. Germany was losing ground steadily, losing irreplaceable men, losing the strategic initiative, and Japanese intelligence officers analyzing Oshima's increasingly strained dispatches understood what their ambassador would never openly admit. The Wehrmacht was being systematically ground down in a brutal war of attrition it simply could not win. The complete collapse of Italy in September 1943 forced an absolute reckoning in Tokyo. Mussolini had been arrested by his own government, then dramatically rescued by German commandos and installed as nothing more than a puppet ruler in northern Italy. But the Italian military had effectively abandoned the war entirely. One of the 3 Axis powers was just gone. In Tokyo, the Supreme War Council convened an emergency session. For the very first time, the genuine possibility of defeat was discussed openly around that table, though the actual word defeat itself was still never spoken aloud. The question they grappled with was whether Japan should seek a separate peace agreement with either China or the Soviet Union to free up desperately needed resources for the Pacific War. The debate split sharply along familiar factional lines that had divided Japanese leadership for years. The Army insisted absolutely that any peace overture would be perceived as fatal weakness and would only encourage the Allies to demand Japan's unconditional surrender. Better to fight on, they argued, demonstrate Japan's iron resolve to the world, and eventually negotiate from a position of renewed strength. The Navy, far more painfully aware of the catastrophic shipping losses and critical fuel shortages that were slowly strangling Japan's entire war effort, argued for seriously exploring diplomatic options, while Japan still controlled significant territories to bargain with. But no real consensus emerged from that heated meeting. It ended with a frustrating decision to simply continue the current strategy while monitoring developments in Europe, as if watching would somehow change their fate. Foreign Minister Shigemitsu Mamoru, who had taken office back in April 1943, understood with painful clarity that monitoring was not a strategy at all. He began making tentative, carefully unofficial contacts with Soviet diplomats in neutral cities, quietly trying to gauge whether Moscow might possibly be willing to mediate some kind of peace between Japan and the Western Allies. The Soviets, still bound by their neutrality pact with Japan, but already secretly planning their eventual entry into the Pacific War at the right moment, gave only non-committal, deliberately vague responses. They were simply waiting, watching carefully to see exactly how far Germany would fall before making their calculated move. In Berlin, the military situation deteriorated relentlessly through the brutal winter of 1943 into 1944. Soviet forces liberated Kiev in November. The horrific siege of Leningrad was finally broken in January. By spring, the unstoppable Red Army was approaching the borders of Poland itself. Ambassador Oshima's reports grew increasingly strained and desperate in tone. He described what he called tactical withdrawals and strategic repositioning, carefully avoiding words like retreat or collapse. He emphasized exciting new German weapons still in development, revolutionary jet aircraft, and devastating rockets that would surely turn the tide of war. He quoted German officials endlessly who promised him that the Anglo-American alliance would inevitably fracture, that Britain and America would eventually realize the Soviet Union was their true mortal enemy and would make common cause with Germany against Bolshevism. Some officials in Tokyo desperately wanted to believe these comforting assurances because the alternative was simply too grim to contemplate seriously. But the cold numbers told a brutally different story. Japanese intelligence analysts estimated total German casualties on the Eastern Front at well over 3 million men by early 1944. The Luftwaffe, which had completely dominated European skies back in 1940, was being systematically destroyed by relentless American daylight bombing raids and devastating British night attacks. German industrial production was somehow holding steady, but critical raw materials were becoming increasingly scarce. The vital Romanian oil fields, which supplied much of Germany's fuel, were now under serious threat from both advancing Soviet armies and long-range American bombers. The massive Allied invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, eliminated any remaining illusions anyone in Tokyo might have still held. Germany now faced the full crushing weight of American and British forces pouring in from the West, while the Soviets continued their relentless grinding advance from the East. In Tokyo, the Supreme War Council met once again in crisis. This time the discussion was painfully blunt and direct. Navy Minister Yonai stated flatly, without diplomatic softening, that Germany would lose the European war within 1 year. The only real questions remaining were exactly how long they could possibly hold out, and whether their continued resistance would buy Japan enough precious time to negotiate acceptable peace terms with the Allies. Prime Minister Tojo, whose political position had been steadily eroding for months due to mounting military disasters across the Pacific, tried desperately to maintain his hardline stance. Germany's situation is certainly difficult, he conceded reluctantly, but not hopeless yet. They still retain significant industrial capacity and millions of men under arms. More importantly, he insisted, our fate is not permanently tied to Germany's fate. We fight for our own national survival and for the liberation of Asia from brutal Western colonialism. Whether Germany ultimately wins or loses, Japan must continue the struggle to the very end. But Tojo's support base was crumbling rapidly beneath him. The catastrophic fall of Saipan in July, which brought American B-29 bombers within comfortable striking range of the Japanese home islands for the first time, delivered the final political blow. Tojo resigned on July 18th, replaced by General Koiso Kuniakai, who had no clearer strategy whatsoever, but at least represented a symbolic change from the failed policies that had led Japan to this disaster. The new government's absolute first priority was conducting a brutally honest assessment of Japan's true strategic position. That assessment was utterly devastating. Japan's merchant fleet, which had numbered over 6 million tons at the war's confident start, was now reduced to less than 2 million tons and sinking faster every single week. American submarines were systematically strangling the vital supply lines to the southern resource territories. Oil imports from the Dutch East Indies, the primary reason Japan had risked going to war in the first place, were now down to a mere trickle. The combined fleet, which had terrorized the entire Pacific in 1942, was now a hollow shadow force desperately short of both fuel and trained pilots. And now Germany, their powerful ally who was supposed to tie down massive American and British resources in Europe indefinitely, was clearly, undeniably losing. The urgent question of what Japan should do about Germany's accelerating collapse divided Japanese leadership into three bitterly opposed factions. The peace faction, centered around Navy Minister Yonai and certain realistic members of the Foreign Ministry, argued passionately that Germany's inevitable defeat made Japan's strategic position completely hopeless. They should seek peace immediately, right now, while they still held at least some territories and bargaining leverage. The moderates, including new Prime Minister Koiso himself, believed Japan should continue fighting for now, but simultaneously explore serious diplomatic channels, possibly through Soviet mediation. The diehards, concentrated heavily in the army and especially among fervent younger officers, insisted absolutely that surrender was utterly unthinkable under any circumstances. Japan must fight to the bitter end, they declared, inflicting such horrific casualties on any invaders that the Allies would eventually be forced to agree to a negotiated peace that preserved the sacred imperial system. Through the increasingly dark fall and winter of 1944, these three factions maneuvered against each other while the military situation worsened daily. In Europe, Soviet armies swept through Poland and drove deep into the Balkans. The Western Allies liberated France and pushed steadily toward Germany's own borders. Ambassador Oshima's dispatches from besieged Berlin took on an almost desperate, pleading quality. He reported that Germany was frantically mobilizing every available man, that miraculous new weapons would soon appear on the battlefield, that the German people's iron will to resist remained completely unbroken. But he also reported, in carefully coded language that fooled absolutely no one reading his cables, that Berlin was actively preparing for a siege, that critical government functions were being moved deep into underground bunkers, that officials were systematically burning mountains of documents. The fall of Manila to American forces in February 1945 brought the war crashing onto Japan's very doorstep. American forces were now clearly poised to invade Okinawa, the final stepping stone before assaulting the home islands themselves. And in Europe, the end was now obviously near. Massive Soviet forces crossed the Oder River, approaching Berlin rapidly from the east. American and British armies crossed the Rhine, advancing methodically from the west. Germany was being literally crushed between two enormous armies, exactly as Japan now feared it might soon be crushed between American forces advancing inexorably from the Pacific and Soviet forces that would inevitably enter the war the moment Germany finally fell. On April 12, 1945, President Franklin Roosevelt suddenly died. Some officials in Tokyo allowed themselves to hope desperately that this might somehow change American war aims, that Roosevelt's successor might prove more willing to negotiate reasonable terms. But President Harry Truman very quickly made absolutely clear he would continue Roosevelt's firm policy of demanding unconditional surrender. There would be no compromise whatsoever, no face-saving peace agreement. Japan would surrender completely and totally, or be utterly destroyed. The news reports from Berlin grew increasingly sporadic as April dragged on. Ambassador Oshima's last substantive dispatch came on April 20th, Hitler's final birthday. He described a brief, grim ceremony held in the Führer's underground bunker, attended by haggard officials who clearly knew the end was now just days away. Oshima himself would soon flee Berlin as Soviet artillery began systematically shelling the city center. On April 30th, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his bunker. On May 7th, Germany surrendered unconditionally to the Allied powers. The Japanese government received official confirmation of Germany's complete surrender on May 8th. Foreign Minister Togo Shigenori, who had returned to office under the new government of Prime Minister Suzuki Kantaro, immediately called an emergency cabinet meeting. For 3 intense hours, the ministers debated what Germany's total defeat meant for Japan's future. The peace faction argued with desperate urgency that continuing this war was now utterly pointless. Japan stood completely alone against the combined, overwhelming might of America, Britain, and very soon the Soviet Union. Every single day of continued fighting brought only more senseless death and destruction to the Japanese people. The time to seek peace was right. Now, immediately, while Japan still possessed at least some bargaining position. The army representatives rejected this argument completely and absolutely. General Anami Korechika, the war minister, stated firmly that Germany's surrender changed absolutely nothing about Japan's sacred obligations. "We did not fight for Germany," he said intensely. "We fought for Japan, for Asia, for the Emperor. Those causes remain unchanged. The Americans demand unconditional surrender, which means the complete end of everything we hold sacred. We simply cannot accept such humiliating terms. We must fight on and make them pay such a horrific price for any invasion that they will eventually agree to terms that preserve the imperial system and Japan's national honor." Prime Minister Suzuki, a retired admiral who had miraculously survived an assassination attempt during the violent February 26th incident 9 years earlier, tried desperately to find some middle ground between these positions. He acknowledged that Germany's defeat was deeply regrettable, but he insisted Japan's situation was fundamentally different. Japan was fighting a defensive war now, protecting its sacred home islands and the emperor himself. The Japanese people's fighting spirit was far stronger than Germany's, their willingness to sacrifice infinitely greater. He proposed continuing the war for now, while simultaneously exploring diplomatic options through whatever neutral parties might still exist. But what neutral parties actually remained with any real influence? Switzerland and Sweden had no meaningful leverage whatsoever with the Allied powers. The Vatican had virtually no influence on American policy. that left only the Soviet Union, which had carefully maintained its neutrality pact with Japan even while simultaneously crushing Germany. Foreign Minister Togo was quietly authorized to approach Soviet Ambassador Yakov Malik with a desperate proposal. Japan would offer truly significant concessions in Manchuria and possibly other territories if the Soviet Union would agree to mediate a peace settlement that preserved the imperial system and avoided complete military occupation. The Soviets, who had already secretly agreed at the Yalta Conference to enter the war against Japan within exactly 3 months of Germany's defeat, gave polite but deliberately non-committal responses. They were simply waiting patiently for precisely the right moment to strike, when they could seize maximum territory with minimum cost. Japan's increasingly desperate diplomatic overtures were useful to them only in that they clearly suggested Japanese desperation, which meant Soviet entry would likely face far less resistance than Moscow had initially expected. Through the brutal months of June and July 1945, the Japanese government remained completely paralyzed by bitter internal divisions. The peace faction pointed repeatedly to the horrific devastation of Japanese cities by relentless American firebombing, the mass starvation spreading rapidly through the civilian population as food supplies dwindled to nothing, the complete collapse of the merchant marine. The army faction countered by pointing to the 60 million Japanese subjects who could theoretically be mobilized for fanatical homeland defense, the thousands of aircraft being carefully held in reserve for massive kamikaze attacks on any invasion fleets, the mountain caves being frantically prepared as underground fortresses. Both sides invoked the emperor's sacred welfare and the nation's eternal honor, but they meant completely different things by those powerful words. Emperor Hirohito himself remained officially silent, as ancient constitutional tradition demanded he must. But in private audiences with senior advisors, he made his personal views increasingly clear. He had carefully read the detailed reports from devastated Germany describing the utter annihilation of Berlin, Hamburg, Dresden, and other once great cities. He understood with perfect clarity that Japan faced identical destruction if this war continued much longer. He had also read intelligence assessments strongly suggesting that the Soviet Union would very soon enter the war, which would make Japan's strategic position completely and utterly hopeless. He desperately wanted peace, but he absolutely could not say so publicly without immediately triggering a violent military coup by fanatical army officers who considered any surrender utterly treasonous. The atomic bombing of Hiroshima on August 6th with a single devastating bomb that instantly destroyed the entire city forced this agonizing issue into the open. The Supreme War Council met in emergency session. For the very first time in history, the emperor spoke directly, explicitly asking his advisors to seriously consider accepting the Potsdam Declaration's terms for surrender. But even this extraordinary imperial intervention was not enough to break the deadlock. The peace faction argued desperately that the atomic bomb made any continued resistance purely suicidal. The army faction argued that the Americans probably possessed only one such bomb, and that Japan must continue fighting regardless of any cost. Then on August 9th, 2 more catastrophes struck simultaneously. A second atomic bomb completely destroyed Nagasaki, and the Soviet Union, having waited exactly 3 months since Germany's surrender as secretly promised, formally declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria with absolutely overwhelming force. Over 1 million Soviet troops backed by thousands of tanks and aircraft smashed through Japanese defenses that had been severely weakened by desperate transfers to the Pacific Front. The Guandong Army, once the absolute pride of Japanese military might, collapsed within mere days. The Supreme War Council met again on the night of August 9th, continuing into the early morning hours of August 10th. The debate was bitter, fierce, and agonizing. Even now, even with two cities completely vaporized and the massive Soviet invasion already underway, the army faction still argued passionately for continuing the fight. They proposed abandoning Manchuria and Korea entirely, withdrawing all remaining forces to the sacred home islands, and preparing for one final apocalyptic battle that would cost the invaders so dearly they would have no choice but to negotiate. The peace faction argued this was complete madness, that millions more would die for absolutely nothing, that the emperor himself and the nation itself would be utterly destroyed. At 2 o'clock in the morning, with the council hopelessly deadlocked 3 votes to 3, Prime Minister Suzuki took an absolutely unprecedented step. He formally asked the emperor to break the tie, to make this terrible decision himself. Emperor Hirohito, speaking slowly and with perfect clarity, said that he simply could not bear to see his people suffer any longer. Japan would accept the Potsdam Declaration and surrender with just one single condition, that the ancient imperial institution be preserved. It was the first time in all of modern Japanese history that an emperor had made such a direct decision on national policy. Even then, incredibly, the struggle was still not over. Army officers, learning of this decision, immediately attempted a desperate coup to prevent the surrender announcement from being broadcast. They seized the imperial palace, frantically searching everywhere for the phonograph recording of the emperor's surrender speech. They failed to find it, and senior officers still loyal to the emperor suppressed the attempted coup by dawn. On August 15th at exactly noon, the emperor's voice was broadcast over radio for the very first time in history, announcing Japan's surrender directly to the Japanese people. In his carefully crafted speech, deliberately worded to avoid ever using the actual word surrender, Hirohito cited several reasons for this heartbreaking decision. He mentioned a new and most cruel bomb that threatened the complete extinction of human civilization. He mentioned the entry of the Soviet Union into the war. But he also said something that revealed exactly how much Germany's defeat had weighed heavily on Japanese strategic thinking. The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage, while the general trends of the world have all turned against her interest. The general trends of the world. It was as close as the emperor would ever come to publicly acknowledging what Japanese leaders had understood since Stalingrad, had deeply feared since Italy's surrender, and had finally accepted after Germany's total collapse, that Japan had gambled everything on an Axis victory that was never, ever going to happen. Germany's defeat had not caused Japan's surrender directly or immediately. The atomic bombs and Soviet invasion were the immediate triggers that forced the final decision. But Germany's long, grinding, inexorable collapse from Stalingrad to Berlin had shaped absolutely every strategic decision Japan made from 1943 onward, every debate, every desperate hope, every delayed choice. In the difficult weeks after the surrender, as American occupation forces arrived and the Japanese government began the deeply humiliating process of total disarmament, some of the intense internal debates finally became public. Admiral Yonai, the Navy minister who had long doubted victory was possible, gave a remarkably candid interview to a Japanese newspaper in which he spoke with unusual frankness. From the moment Germany could not defeat the Soviet Union, he said quietly, our war was completely unwinnable. We continued fighting for 2 more terrible years, not because we genuinely believed we could somehow win, but because we could not agree on acceptable terms for losing. That disagreement cost hundreds of thousands of precious lives. General Enemy, the war minister who had argued so passionately for fighting to the absolute end, committed ritual suicide on the morning of August 15th, just hours after the emperor's surrender broadcast. He left behind a note that read simply, I apologize with my death for my great crime. Whether that crime was leading Japan into a hopeless war or accepting surrender before fighting to complete extinction, he did not specify. Ambassador Oshima, who had spent so many years in Berlin absolutely convinced that Germany would ultimately prevail, was arrested by American forces and later tried at the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. His testimony there revealed the stunning depth of his tragic miscalculation. He had believed until almost the very end that German technology and fighting spirit would somehow overcome Soviet numbers and American industrial might. He had consistently reported what he desperately wanted to believe rather than what he actually observed. His overly optimistic dispatches had helped sustain dangerous Japanese illusions about Axis prospects long after those prospects had completely vanished. The final accounting was absolutely grim. Japan had entered this war with Germany as its powerful ally, genuinely believing that together they could reshape the entire world. They had watched Germany march from stunning victory to stunning victory in 1940 and 1941 and had convinced themselves that the Axis was truly invincible. But Germany's catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad had cracked that certainty. Italy's surrender had deepened the terrible doubt. D-Day had made the ultimate outcome crystal clear. And Germany's final collapse had left Japan facing alone the exact same overwhelming forces that had completely crushed the Wehrmacht. What Japanese high command actually said when they learned Germany was losing varied dramatically by person and by time. Some, like Yonai, had suspected from the very beginning and grew more certain with each German setback. Others, like Tojo, had insisted on maintaining optimism even as the evidence mounted against them. Still others, like Anime, had argued that Germany's fate was ultimately irrelevant to Japan's sacred duty. But beneath all the public statements and in the private debates, there was a growing understanding that the Tripartite Pact had bound Japan to a losing cause, and that extricating themselves from that cause without admitting defeat was impossible. In the end, what they said mattered far less than what they actually did. They continued fighting long after Germany's defeat became inevitable. Unable to agree on how to end a war they increasingly knew they could not win. The cost of that paralysis was measured in cities destroyed, populations starved, and hundreds of thousands of lives lost in the final months of a war whose outcome had been determined on the frozen steppes outside Stalingrad, on the beaches of Normandy, and in the smoking ruins of Berlin. Japan's leaders had watched Germany fall, understood what it meant, and marched forward anyway into the abyss.